Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of DQC's summer opportunities to make data work for students in the Every Student Succeeds Act playlist, as we're calling it. We're doing a series of 6 webinars focused on different data opportunities in the law. And this week we're focusing on per-pupil expenditure as a new way to measure what matters. My name is Brennan McMahon-Parton. I'm the Associate Director for State Policy and Advocacy here at the Data Quality Campaign. And today I'm excited to be joined by Marguerite Rosa, who is the Director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, along with a lot of other really cool stuff on your resume I was noticing, Marguerite. So thank you for joining us and welcome.
Happy to be here.
Good. Well, before I dive into my conversation with Marguerite, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping and do a little bit of recap from our last webinar, as well as talk about some of the overarching issues and opportunities that we see in the Every Student Succeeds Act for ESSA at DQC. So let me start first with housekeeping. If you're joining on the Hangout, there is a question, a Q&A box that should appear on your right, and please feel free throughout our webinar to ask questions via that chat box. But we're also turning the model a little bit on its head today. Today, Marguerite has some questions for you. And I've answered some of these questions before. It's pretty fun. So I recommend chiming in. It's a no stakes test. So it just helps us foster a dialogue. So find that questions box and join us in the conversation.
So I think we were going to use the chat box because we'll have the questions on the screen. And if I remember correctly, those are different boxes. So the chat one is the top box on the left.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And it depends on if they're watching it via YouTube or via Hangout.
Oh, sorry.
They'll be able to see a Q&A box there. I also hope that if you're social media savvy, that you'll join us by tweeting along. The Data Quality Campaign handle is @EdDataCampaign, and we're using the hashtag ESSAOps for this webinar series. So please join us and tweet. Just to recap a little bit about last time, like I said, we're doing a series of webinars focused on different data opportunities in the law. And last week we talked about opportunities to really round out the picture of student success. Not just focusing on academic performance as measured by reading and math, but also 3 other measures that we think are really important: chronic absence, post-secondary indicators, and student growth. Just a reminder, some of the highlights of the conversation my colleague Rachel Anderson and I had. Chronic absence. I think it's important to reinforce that chronic absence is not just attendance and it's not just truancy, that we're talking both excused and unexcused absences, and that a student can be chronically absent by missing as few as 2 days a month. Post-secondary indicators. ESSA only went so far as to say that states should report post-secondary enrollment where available. Data Quality Campaign is encouraging states and advocates to push for not just that enrollment information, but also remediation and retention, and that the value of this information is in part feeding that back to high schools so that school leaders, but also parents, can understand how schools are doing in preparing students for success after high school. And finally, student growth, not required in the law, but pretty heavily signaled throughout the law. This is a critical piece of information, particularly in the hands of teachers and parents, and so we encourage states to use some of those dollars in the law to refine and continue to improve their growth models and make sure they're getting that information to the hands of those who need it. Just doing a little bit, like I said, setting the frame about ESSA. From our perspective, ESSA is a bill. It's a bill about civil rights. It's a bill about meeting student needs, but it's also a bill about data. And so while it does represent a shift in the federal approach to education and pushing some of that authority and autonomy back to states and districts, it does conserve the legacy of its predecessor, No Child Left Behind, by highlighting the importance of data, of getting information out there to demonstrate what works and what doesn't for students. And there are 4 key opportunities, overarching opportunities, that we see that come with the Every Student Succeeds Act. One, and I'm going to say they're all important, but one important one is that this is an opportunity to reset the conversation across states, across the country. We've seen so much concern about things like student data privacy and testing and even state standards like the Common Core, that it's an opportunity to say, hey, we heard you, communities and parents and families, and this is what we're doing to think differently, or maybe build on the same great work that we've already been doing in our state. Two, obviously of utmost importance to us as data quality campaign, is that ESSA represents an opportunity to use different data for different purposes. So much of the angst around No Child Left Behind is that people felt sort of boxed into math and reading. That was the measure of student success. That was the root of transparency. It was the root of accountability. What we want states to be thoughtful about now is what are the different information, the broader picture that can be part of transparency, and that ties into a little bit what we're talking about today, versus what are those direct needles that you want people to move for accountability and continuous improvement. So really thinking about what picture belongs where and how do we think bigger than math and reading. Third is meet your data system where it is. And again, really tying into the conversation I'm going to have with Marguerite today. I've heard state leaders say, we're going to have to collect hundreds of more data points. And I've also heard state leaders say, you know what, we've pretty much got what we need to meet the requirements of this law. So it's an opportunity, and really it's necessary for state leaders to take stock of what they have already. So many states already have a lot of valuable information, thinking about what kinds of questions those data answer, and then thinking what, if anything, because there will be some things, including per-pupil expenditure information that we're going to talk about, that you have to do differently, and building out a data system that meets those needs and answer those questions. And fourth, and finally, and critically, is stakeholder engagement. The law, interestingly, requires that you engage with stakeholders, but this absolutely cannot just be about box checking. And in fact, nothing that states should do around ESSA should only be about box checking and meeting the needs of a federal law. It should be about meeting education goals. And Congress sent a pretty clear signal that in order to set and meet education goals, you have to engage with communities. And from our perspective, this can't just be a listening tour. It can't just be about rounding up the usual suspects. State leaders need to be thinking about who are the people who haven't had an opportunity to be at the table at the past, in addition to some of those usual and really important suspects, and not just listen, but demonstrate back to people what you heard and what you did with that information. This is going to be such the crux of success in implementing this big and important law, and probably what's going to be the federal law of the land for quite a long time if we can take NCLB, No Child Left Behind, as any model. While not written in response to ESSA data quality campaign, building on our history of roadmaps and recommendations for states that help them leverage the power of data to improve student outcomes, has a roadmap, the 4 policy priorities, in which we ask states to think about measuring what matters, being clear about what students need to achieve, and having the data to ensure that all students are on track. 2, make data use possible, which is about providing teachers and leaders with the flexibility, the resources, the support they need to ask questions, answer questions, and take action. 3, be transparent and earn trust, which encompasses a lot of the opportunities in the Every Student Succeeds method. It's about ensuring every community understands how its schools and students are doing, why data is valuable. And finally, guarantee access and protect privacy, providing teachers and parents with timely information on their students and make sure it's kept secure. We think that there are a lot of opportunities in ESSA that across those first 3 priorities that we've laid out can help states get there. ESSA did not go far enough on providing supports to guarantee access to secure information to those closest students, but it did make a big play on transparency, on making sure that communities have public information, which is the perfect segue to the conversation now I want to have with Marguerite. This is about a reporting requirement, but like I said, this isn't just about checking boxes or complying with the federal law. This is about really making information that's useful, that's accessible, and informs people's decision making. So quickly, what the Every Student Succeeds Act requires around per-pupil expenditures is that states must include per-pupil spending by school on report cards. These expenditures must be reported by funding source, so meaning by federal, state, and local, and must include actual, not average personnel salaries. So again, that's per-pupil expenditure reported by school disaggregated by funding stream, and including actual salaries. So Marguerite, to begin our conversation, we know this is a big deal. Why is this such a big deal?
Well, I think a great way to kick it off is to put it back to the audience with a question. And I don't know if we could transfer that question to the screen, but the question we have for you all, and you could type the answer into the group chat, is on average, how much is spent in public funds per pupil in the United States on K-12 education? So ballpark estimate. This is your chance. I don't know, can folks see the question? I don't know if there's a way to do that.
I think it is pushed.
Is on there? Okay. Mm-hmm. On average, how much is spent in public funds per pupil in the U.S.?
I'm going to take my stab too at this. Let's see. Don't be shy, audience.
Yes, we will not hold you to these answers.
No stakes test.
Yeah, low stakes, no stakes. So we're getting a couple of answers. We have, kind of going back to the two boxes, one is 7,500, one is 11,000 per pupil, one is 10,000 per pupil. Any others? Interestingly, this is a question that when I do principal training, I often ask the principals, how much on average is spent per pupil for the students in your school? And what is really interesting is that they don't know. And we'll get answers that are all over the range, and we'll get numbers that are down in the $4,000 a student category. We'll get numbers that are even below that. In actuality, the average right now in the United States is somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 to $13,000 a student. But there's a reason why the principals, for the most part, haven't known. It's because we don't really have that information, nor do we weave it in to our report cards in any sort of meaningful way, nor do we try to leverage that data as a way to try to improve our schools. And this is just a sort of a teaser question, because this new requirement that in the federal law, that we report spending by school will now allow us, for the first time ever, to line up spending and outcomes by school. So we've had the outcomes data for a while by school. That was, the previous law. So we're going to have to measure it. So we took the stab at saying we think that the school is the right unit to measure student outcomes, but we didn't yet have the spending. And we didn't have that because most districts don't report spending by school. In fact, very few do. Most states don't either. Some of them have the data, but it's not a calculation that they've done in the past. But doing so can help you get a picture like the one that you should see on your screen right now, which is spending per pupil on the horizontal down at the bottom. And we just pulled up math performance here, and this subset of schools, every dot is a school, is all Washington State elementary schools with greater than 75% poverty. So these are high poverty elementary schools. We actually eliminated the really small schools. I can't remember what the cutoff was. So they're really actually like schools in the sense they're all high poverty schools. And what you can see is that the spending and the outcomes all vary all over the place. It's a scatter plot. We have schools in the upper right-hand quadrant that are relatively expensive compared to some of their peers and yet have great outcomes, or relative to their peers anyway. The lower right-hand quadrant, those are expensive schools that so far are lagging performance of their peers. Of their peers meaning other high poverty schools that are elementary schools. In the lower left-hand quadrant, those are also lower performing schools, but they are shortchanged financially relative to their peers. Some of them might be in the same district as one of the ones sort of to the right of the middle line and might have a bone to pick on an equity issue. Those in the upper left-hand quadrant, where the red dot is, are schools where they're spending less than the median for the state for high poverty schools, and yet their students are beating the odds for the high poverty students that attend there. And so those are the schools, for one, that we might learn something from and potentially spread their practices. But so far, we haven't used these data and put them to work for improving schools and districts generally. So there's an enormous amount of value in this new requirement. It's an exciting requirement with lots of implications, and I thought we can jump through those, but also acknowledge that for states this will be a big new requirement, and states don't have the data systems in place to report these, and so there will be a lot of activity just to meet this requirement.
Yeah. All helpful. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the what states need to do to get this done. And to your point, we know the data systems aren't quite there, but you touched a little bit in talking about the chart back there about schools that may have a bone to pick with equity. And I think some of the motivation for getting this into the law is about that. Can you touch a little bit more on that subject, or what you meant by that?
Sure, and we'll do that before we go to the next two questions. But there has been some interest attached to the equity component of this data, partly because we've known for a while that depending on the district, there are maybe a large district where a larger portion of funds from the district land in one school versus another. So some schools in the district might be essentially drawing down a greater share of the funds than their peers. Those allocations inside districts aren't inherently equal. They should be, because uneven spending inside a district has nothing to do with property values or access to resources. Remember, the district has all its money. It's the one with the bank account, and it decides how to divvy them up. So whether or not you're also working on equity issues across districts, which this data will also help illuminate, there also going to be the opportunity to use the data to assess equity within a district, and that'll be a relatively new thing. And in places where there are schools that are disproportionately negatively affected by spending equities inside a district, this new data will arm them to have those conversations with their district, in part because it's difficult to accept accountability for outcomes if the schools aren't operating on a level playing field. So that's the equity piece that will be quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we think it's so important. We're finding that a lot of people are not really aware of this provision of the law, or not quite sure what the implications could be, and I think you just hit on a pretty huge one. So to that, what is it going to take for states to get this done? And maybe talk a little bit about what a sense of timing that you have for states to be able to bring something like this online.
Sure. So for the most part, districts have been asked, and this came back to federal guidelines a long time ago, but districts had been asked to report their spending in object categories or function categories. So a district's budget often shows how much it spends on certificated instructional staff, or how much it spends on benefits, or how much it spends on special education, which would be a functional category. And what it doesn't do is say how much did it spend on Maple Leaf Elementary versus Cedar Grove Elementary, sort of dividing up the money across schools. And having asked lots of districts for their financial data, I used to ask for the financial data by school, and generally the answer is always the same. We don't carve the money up that way. So we don't have it broken out like that. So it's not that it's impossible. My center has taken the data from lots of districts and then carved it up for them, so they could show how much is spent at each school. And part of doing that just means finding the salaries of the staff that work at Maple Leaf Elementary, finding the salaries of the staff that work at Cedar Grove, figuring out on the centrally managed funds like the HR department or legal services, how to divide those up equitably across the school, so we can calculate effectively how much is spent at each school. But for many districts, that will be a new step. The data are there, they just haven't run the calculations like this. In some states actually have the data. So the state might have, for instance, all the data on all the employees of all the districts, and know where they work, so they can kind of crunch the numbers and figure out spending by school, at least get close on it. Sometimes they might not have the expenditures on books broken out by school or things like that. But so some states may already have it, but they may not, again, know they have it or have carved it up in this way. And so in order to get those per pupil calculations, it means that we're going to have to take the financial data that already exists, divide it up differently, and then divide it out by enrollment counts and things like that to get the actual per pupil spending for each school. So it's a relatively big task, and in some states it's a much bigger task than in others. But I think bigger and more important than the actual math behind the calculations or the accounting behind the calculations is going to be the display and utility of the data. So if a state, the state can be compliant and put some number on it on every school report card, but the state also has the opportunity here to build something that will be enormously helpful to schools as they try to do the most for their students with the money they have. And that is the bigger opportunity.
Absolutely. And your the point you just raised about visualization, I think, is a huge one, and one that DQC is absolutely going to be looking for. We're in the middle right now of looking to every state's report card, not looking for this piece yet, but looking for the different requirements in ESSA as well as other kind of indicators. And we know that too often some really important information, and some of the information that we're finding is really important to parents, is buried. It's 7 and 8 and 9, 10 clicks into the website if you can understand an easy way to get to the website at all. So you're absolutely right. It's not just about not doing compliance and checking the box. Don't bury it and then go further to make it useful. So talk a little bit more about that. What can states do to drive useful decision making with this information?
Well, I think if we look toward what the data mean, then we can work our way back to say what's the best way to display the data. And so we brought 2 more questions for you all. So hopefully you can see one on the screen. It's a true or false question. You can type your answer, true or false, into the group chat or to the question and answer chat. And here's the question. 2 schools with roughly the same mix of students can spend the same amount of money and get different results. So 2 schools, same money, different results, even though they have the same mix of students. So let's see. What do you all think here? True or false? 2 schools with roughly the same mix of students can spend the same amount of money and get different results. So hopefully on your end you're saying, of course that's true. Plus I showed you a graph that showed that it was true. Those were all high poverty schools. They had 2 that had about the same amount of money and they got different results. That is true. If we move on to the second question though, it causes us to pause before we think that the answer is what many people think it is. So oftentimes what we'll hear in response to that first question is, it depends on how the money is spent. And surely, partly, that is true. But before we go too far on that, let's ask the second question. 2 schools with roughly the same mix of students can spend the same amount of money in the same way and get different results. True or false?
And you may give people just a few extra seconds, Margaret, because there's a lag between us talking and them hearing us.
Okay.
I'm going to answer 2 though.
All right, so again, two schools with roughly the same mix of students can spend the same amount of money in the same way and get different results. So they could have the same mix of staff, all on the same salary schedule, pay the nurse the same amount of money, the teachers maybe even the same amount of money, use the same expenditure on technology, and yet get different results. So the answer is true, and I think instinctively we all know it's true. And the reason we ask that question is because many people have an inflated sense of what we can learn from how the money is spent. And so what they're often thinking is, if we can just figure out the right way to spend the money and have everybody do it, we'll have better outcomes. And the truth is, in our research, and this is really honestly kind of a bummer of a finding if you're an ed finance researcher that spent a lot of years doing this, which is that the two schools can spend the money in the same way and get really different outcomes. And what that suggests is that there is something going on inside schools that matters a lot, that's not only about the finance. And that's what we tend to say is that's all the sort of human messiness inside schools, the sort of relationships between teachers and students, the level of effort that people bring to their job, their compassion, the students' motivation, their connection to the community, all this other kind of stuff matters. And often when we think about finance data, we ignore all of that stuff. And what I think can be more powerful is if we think about the finance data as harnessing all that human stuff, giving the people in the schools some sort of way to measure how well they're doing given the funds that they have to spend. And that's the opportunity here. Instead of ignoring that human element, is to get a finance data structure that links spending to outcomes, that lets those in the schools harness that sense of what's going on, or how well is what we're doing working, that sense of continuous improvement, drive toward a goal of better outcomes, and then benchmark it. So when you think about a data display, and this is one that that we've worked on for one location, is that we like a lot, is that the data needs to divide the spending and outcomes up into quadrants like this, and allow schools to benchmark their own outcomes and against their spending. Sort of, if you're that school that is a star, you can say, here's how much I spend, look at that. There are schools that spend less than I spend, or spend about what I spend, and yet get the same kinds of outcomes that I do, or much better outcomes. How can we look into what our peers are doing? How can we see if there are any strategies that we can learn from and apply them in our school? Or how can we roll up our sleeves and get more for the money that we have? And that might mean working smarter, or working harder, or working differently, or troubleshooting, and so on. And so in that sense, our best ideas for how to display the data is put it on the report cards, but make sure that school leaders and district leaders can tap this data in a larger system that both allows them to see how they're doing, look into the spending of different schools, see if there's anything to be learned. Maybe they find in this data set a similar school to theirs. Allow them to filter the data, and you can see we have filters in this picture at the bottom. If you're a rural school with a lot of bilingual ed students, maybe you're a K-12 school, then looking at a bunch of data from urban settings isn't really helpful. But if you could filter the data to find other rural schools with lots of bilingual ed students that are K-12 in one building, then you can start to say, what can I learn from my peers that have the same context as I have? And so we think those filters are really important in this kind of a thing. So to summarize, you want the spending to be able to be aligned with the outcomes. You want to make sure that the data are filtered, and that individual schools can dig down deep, maybe click on these other schools and find out what their spending patterns are, both as a way to explore new ways of spending their money that might work for them, but also just as a way to continuously benchmark their own progress, and potentially use the data to motivate their own staff. So, sit down with your team and say, what could we do that drives our outcomes given where our spending level is?
So just to make a connection point, I mean, what you're saying is ultimately, while this information, you have to report it publicly as a federal compliance exercise, which is fine, that the most important thing is that you create tools that roll down to districts and schools and inform thinking and help answer questions. And this is a point we've been making across topics, when we talked about chronic absence in the previous webinar, okay, fine, you have to report that information. The most important part is that you get it down to the district via on-track or early warning system that helps, drive decision making or answer questions. Really, across opportunities within this law, it should not just be about box checking on your report card, but meeting people's needs and helping them make better decisions. One audience question, Marguerite, about is this chart available to the public in some way, and if so, where?
That's a good question. So this one, I don't know, I'm happy to share it. I have other, some publications which we can follow up with at the end that sort of outline some of the basic features that should be in a state financial transparency system. And we can also make the few slides that I've used here available to folks.
Sure, and happy to link some of that stuff via the DQC website as well. I want to continue down this people and decision-making piece, but I have somewhat more of a logistics technical question too. You talk about the need to build a system and have the sort of infrastructure in place in order to do this. A question that we've heard a lot and heard a lot of debate around is about common chart of accounts and the role of that from the state. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the importance and the role of a common chart of accounts to fostering this kind of work?
So a lot of people are asking about the common chart of accounts, and you'll see that written as COA, chart of accounts. So for those who may not know that lingo, what a common chart of accounts would be is a way of accounting for your spending that uses all the same kind of codes that everybody else uses. So that if we used a common way of accounting for our spending, then it would be easier to roll up those that accounting system in a way that provides commonalities across all districts. And this may seem surprising coming from me, but I actually think that that may be one of the lesser important elements of getting a good system in place. And partly is because of what I pointed out before, which is a lot of what matters in the relationship between spending and outcomes are a whole bunch of other human things that are going on inside schools. If we thought all the answers were in the data on how the money was spent, then we would want the most precise and uniform chart of accounts possible. But in our more than one decade of looking at financial data, oftentimes we find that the essential ingredients inside schools are things like just how amazing the chess teacher is, and half the kids are like hooked on chess and they love school because of chess and they're coming to school over and over again and the school's like the chess champion of the state or something like that. They're not replicable because that guy, the chess guy or something, is the secret sauce. So what they have done that's smart is build a school around that and allowed that element, that success piece that they have to thrive and to use it as a way to hook kids in. If they said, sorry, we got to make a cut in the chess team, but we do still have swim team and something else, it wouldn't be the same. They've protected chess because it's worked for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if every school hired a chess coach, we would have that same outcome. And so I think less important than, more than the exact chart of accounts will be the data that allows people to benchmark what schools are spending in total against their outcomes. And that needs, a relatively simple chart of accounts to get that done. So chart of accounts can be an important and helpful thing. Most states actually have a chart of accounts in place, a common chart of accounts. And the question is whether or not it has enough information that allows the spending to be coded by school. Some places where it doesn't, the chart of accounts can be merged with payroll data, and then you pretty much essentially have what you need. So I guess I don't think that the most critical thing is the chart of accounts. But it does bring up that issue of whether or not we have enough information to get the spending by school.
Great. So going back to this more the people piece and the use piece, chart of accounts aside, you showed us some tables about the kinds of information that help people make decisions. So who is this information most useful for? Who do we hope to see acting on this data?
So we think of the data as being really valuable at several different levels. But first, and obviously, as I've described here before, it's important for principals or any sort of building leader. They need to know, for the most part, many building leaders have thought, I cannot improve my outcomes unless I get something more from the district, and have sort of raised the flag, I don't have enough money for a summer program or something like that. And what we think is helpful for them is to see how other schools maybe make trade-offs. Maybe they have the same amount of money that they have, but they've chosen to have larger class sizes and a summer program or something that offsets the cost. So we want principals to sort of see what's possible, and potentially learn from schools that are getting greater outcomes for their data, and then use that data in working with their staff to figure out how they can do the most for the students they have. So that's an obvious one. It also can help principals in communicating maybe with their community. So the community in the chess example I gave you might be saying, we really want to spend more money on a hockey team or something like that. And what the school can say is, look, we need to protect what we're doing. It's working. If we compare our spending choices compared to our peers, right now our outcomes are higher. So let's stick with what we've got. And if we want to use, private money for the hockey team or do something else with that, great. But right now what we have is working. Or we need to make trade-offs. What we have isn't working. So I know change is hard, but we're driving toward getting the same outcomes that your peers have with the money that we have. So I think that's one big bucket of conversation. There's another one for districts, and for the most part, districts use some sort of formula, either a staffing formula, a student formula, or just sort of a spreadsheet to divvy up their resources. And often districts aren't thinking about how equitable those allocations are. They haven't taken stock of whether or not the spending at Maple Leaf far exceeds the spending at Cedar Grove Elementary, and yet the two schools serve roughly the same mix of students. Maybe even Cedar Grove serves higher need students, and we haven't really added it up and taken a look at that. If we want schools to do the kinds of things I mentioned, with them working hard toward getting the most for their kids, those schools have to know that they are funded fairly and equitably with the resources at hand. And so there'll be a chance for districts to look at their data and start to think about how we might make changes over time, and how to make trade-offs with our communities to make sure that all our schools have an equitable access to those funds. So that's an important district role to play. There's also a state role to play. I should point out that if the school isn't getting its share of the resources, it can use these data to make that equity claim on its district. I should also point out that a city sometimes, some cities are working with a handful of districts, or maybe a district and some charter schools, and they'll want to be thinking about how the public funds available in their city are fueling schools that are getting the most for their students. And this is a different kind of conversation that we've had. Some cities are looking at charters versus district schools, but if we started to think about those schools that are able to get more for their type of students, then we would be changing the nature of that conversation. So those are some real obvious places for where the data can be useful.
And it's our sense this is going to start a lot of conversations across states and communities that hopefully will be exciting and lead, to your point, to equitable resources and equitable outcomes or improved equitable outcomes for kids. My colleague Rachel asks, what are the types of questions that people should be asking themselves? She's telling me now that you answered the question, but I think it's worth continuing on that. Are principals equipped to sit down with this information and look at it and form a question? Do they know where to start?
So we actually, our center works with a lot of principals and does regular training on this kind of data. And I'd have to say that principals get pretty good, pretty fast. They haven't had it before, and so we say they're the stages of grief at the beginning. You know, maybe they're not spending as their not outcomes aren't as high as they thought. I mean, one of the things I should have mentioned when I showed that other scatter plot is you want to adjust have some sort of student outcome measure that takes into account the mix of students that a school has, whether you're doing that with growth scores or with some other way to adjust the scores. And we have a couple of ideas on how to do that. But we say it's the stages of grief because sometimes what you'll see is the immediate reaction is, wow, well, we're expensive, but that's because I have a lot of really senior teachers. It's not my fault the district gave us these teachers, and they're mediocre at best, and I'm not getting the outcomes, but that's not my fault. And we'll say pretty quickly, well, have you talked about that with your staff? Have you said to your staff, gee, we're an expensive school. We're using a larger than average share of public funds, and our outcomes aren't that great. How can we put that experience that we have in our team to work for these kids? So how can we get the most for those dollars? Surely there are other expensive schools out there, and some of them look quite successful. So let's figure out how to take our decades worth of experience in working with kids and get the most for it. So once we find that, you know, a few of them will look and say things like, gee, this other school is able to get better outcomes than I am, but they're allowed to use their money for some of their money for a boot camp jumpstart program in the summer, and we're not allowed to. And then we'll say things like, you're not allowed? Have you talked to your district about that? If you think that's what your students need, you know, or that program could be really good, you know your students best, advocate for them. You know, maybe the district can't just give you extra resources, but they might be able to make a trade-off with you. If you think the most important thing is this summer program, are you willing to trade a half-time vice principal salary for the summer program to make it work? You know, are you able to go with slightly larger class sizes to do that? And once we find that principals have been teased with a little bit of that information, they seem to be generally excited. The job of principal is more empowering. It's one that comes with more opportunity to do more for their students with the money that they have. So it is sort of a bigger set of tools for them to deploy. But dealing with money is something that most people know how to do. They do it in their household finances all the time. And once they have visibility into it, sometimes it's just as much for them to say something like, wow, now that I know that we spend, you know, $95,000 on a fully loaded librarian position, I'm going to get more for that position. I'm going to talk to my librarian about how can we use that time to move the needle on reading. It's not going to be anymore just about book talks or time off for teachers to send their kids down to the library. I want to use that FTE and all those funds to try to really drive some improvement in my reading scores. And that might mean that the librarian spends the librarian's time differently going forward. So we find that the principals can get good at it pretty quickly, and some of them will be really fast. Some of them might keep doing what we've been doing, but we'll learn from those that kind of leapfrog ahead, and that's why we think there's a lot of power in these data.
You heard it here, folks. Power in a federal data compliance reporting requirement to empower principals to take control of their school. I love that. Marguerite, I know that you have to catch a plane here shortly, but I do want to ask you one more question while we're talking about federal compliance. It's the question people ask me most as I've been trying to get smart on this topic. What, if anything, are the feds going to do with this data?
So I don't think there's a plan yet for the feds to do anything. I think the federal requirement was that the states surface the data so that they are available to schools and communities. The point isn't to put it all on some zip drive and send it in to Washington, D.C. The point is that it may be available on the school report cards. And so this isn't so much as a compliance with federal rules requirement, but the opportunity to create an information system that hopefully will drive some improvements in the school system. So by allowing people to leverage their public funds in ways that can get the most for the kids.
That's fantastic and leads us to the perfect conclusion point for the webinar. Thank you, Marguerite. That we've been talking about this and tweeting about this as ESSA opportunities. What a chance, what an obligation for states to think past checking the boxes that Congress and USAID have laid out for them, and instead to really make powerful tools and get them into the hands of people, whether that be through publicly available data or pushing that information down to schools and districts, and ideally both. And you've heard Marguerite talk so much about decision making and empowerment, which is amazing. Not only about focusing on compliant, and yes, you are going to have to get your data house in order. There is going to be some system work to do, but the point is to improve the way schools work on behalf of students. That's easy to say, and it's harder to act on, but it is hard work worth doing. So we're excited at DQC, and I'm sure you are, Marguerite, to watch what states do, to see who really emerges out front and thinks about all the equity and decision making and spending wisely decisions that states have the potential to drive because of this new requirement. Thank you so much, Marguerite, for joining us. Thank you to the audience, and especially those members of Team DQC who have been chatting along. I appreciate it. I hope that you will join us. Like I said at the top, this is a summer-long series. We do have 2 more conversations about opportunities in the Every Student Succeeds Act left this summer. Our next one is on Wednesday, August 17th at 3 p.m., where we'll be discussing further how ESSA creates an opportunity for leaders to engage with parents and communities. Check out the event page at dataqualitycampaign.org to learn more about the event, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.